Thank you all for coming to this Authors at Google Talk. My name's Katina Johnson, and I'm a manager in online sales and operations. I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Amy Goodman. Goodman is an award-winning journalist, investigative journalist, and syndicated columnist. She's an author and host of Democracy Now!, which airs on more than 800 public TV and radio stations worldwide. She's had 4 New York Times bestsellers. 3 of those were co-authored with her brother, journalist David Goodman. And in fact, when Amy was here last, it was in April of 2008, she and her brother promoted their book, Standing Up to the Madness. That was also a time when the presidential campaign was starting to heat up. And with all that's happened in politics in the last couple of years since then, it seems like there's even more madness to stand up to now. And that's exactly what her role has been during her career as a journalist. So today she's going to talk about her most recent book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. It's a collection of wide-ranging articles that cover a lot of the hot-button issues, like the wars, and one that's definitely front of mind in the news, immigration. Bill Moyers, who wrote the introduction, describes it as a reality check. He goes on to say that you can learn more of the truth about Washington and the world from 1 week of Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Than from a year of Sunday morning talk shows. So we only have an hour today. She's going to talk for about 45 minutes. But I suspect there's a lot that we can learn from her right now. So please join me in welcoming Amy Goodman.
Well, it's great to be here, and hello to everyone in the satellite facilities. Why don't I start off by asking how many of you have ever seen or heard or read Democracy Now! Online? Where do you watch it? Online? Radio? KPFA. Television? KRCB, PBS, and public access in Marin County, and depending on where you are. Well, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded 61 years ago in the Bay Area in Berkeley. KPFA, the first station. And it was founded by a man named Lou Hill. He was a World War II conscientious objector, and when he came out of the detention camps, he said there's got to be a media outlet that is run not by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists, and that's how Pacifica was born. The first Pacifica station, KPFA, 49, then KPFK in Los Angeles, 59, 1960, my station in New York, WBAI, WPFW in Washington, 1977, KPFT in Houston, 1970. Those are the 5 Pacifica stations. That station in Houston is the only one in the country whose transmitter was blown up. In the first few months of operation, the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet, they blew it up again. Now, the silver lining was it's not as if they had money for advertising or anything, so it certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. I don't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is, because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether a Palestinian child, an Israeli grandmother, an Afghan aunt, an uncle from Afghanistan, you come to understand them a little better. You don't necessarily have to agree, but you understand where they're coming from. We need a media in this country that builds bridges between communities rather than advocates the bombing of bridges. The media can be a great force for peace, but that's not how it's used in this country. I just came from Stanford, speaking last night to a conference today on the future of journalism. And for all of the new ways, interesting ways of distributing media and all the new possibilities, and what with newspapers folding, what does it mean, and where is journalism going? I think we still have to get back to the very important basics of journalism, holding those in power accountable. Simple as that. My brother David and I wrote these 3 books. The first is called The Exception to the Rulers, and that's what media should be. That's the motto of democracy now, the exception to the rulers. The second one is called Static, and the reason we call it that is because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we ever get is static. That veil of distortion, lies, misrepresentations, and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And that's not the kind of media we have in this country. People talk a lot about how the reason newspapers are being shuttered around the country is, well, because of the internet. There's other ways to get information. I think that's partly true. But I also think newspapers bury themselves by not telling the truth, by icing out the voices of dissent that really are what could have saved them and all of us. I mean, let's just look at the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. And the reason I go back to this, it is so important. A country can't make a more serious decision than going to war, than sending young men and women and not so young men and women to kill or be killed. And so we should talk about it all the time when we're doing it. And we are doing it big time. In Iraq, we just passed the 7th anniversary of the war. In Afghanistan, we're on 9 years, longer than the US was involved in Vietnam. It's truly astounding. About 5 weeks before the US invaded Iraq, General Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, gave his push for war at the United Nations. The group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, did a study of the 2 weeks around that speech. That was February 5th, 2003. They looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts: NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, and the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. 4 newscasts, the agenda-setting news in this country. In that 2-week period, there were 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? Underestimate, 0. But you're close. Still an underestimate, 1. You overestimated 5. So 3. 3 of almost 400 were with anti-war leaders. That is no longer a mainstream media, because about half the population was opposed to war then. But they brought out 3 of 400 voices. That's an extreme media, beating the drums for war. And I really do believe that those who are opposed to war, those who are opposed to torture, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. It really does matter. I think the media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile, and the Pentagon's deployed the media. So we've got to get it back. I think the embedding process brought the media to an all-time low. You know the embedding process, where reporters get embedded in the front lines of troops, which Victoria Clark, who was the spokesperson for the Pentagon, helped craft the whole embed program, called it a spectacular success, which of course why it's a very serious failure. The idea of the embedding process is you get this, immediate view. Yes, but from only one perspective, from the trigger end of the war. I'm not saying reporters aren't brave who are embedded. But when you're sleeping with the troops, eating with the troops, when your life is in their hands, you're going to report a certain way. And you have a certain perspective. If you're going to have reporters embedded in troops, you need reporters embedded in Afghan hospitals, in Iraqi communities, in the peace movement around the world, to understand the full effects of war. And the problem isn't only the embedding process in troops, covering troops. It's being embedded and the establishment in Washington. You know, how often you hear these softball questions at the White House. We call it the access of evil, right? Trading truth for access, and it's not worth it. It's a disservice. We have to protect journalism, and we have to promote journalism. Reporters around the world face very serious consequences for their work, especially Arab media workers and journalists in Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to talk about WikiLeaks in a minute. But I want to talk about something less serious, but it does have serious ramifications, and that was a recent trip that I took with my colleagues just from here to Vancouver, or attempted to take. It was Thanksgiving, and I was on a book tour for Breaking the Sound Barrier, and since everyone is eating turkey here, we thought we'd talk turkey in Canada. So we headed from Seattle to the border and then up to Vancouver. I was going to be speaking at the Vancouver Public Library. Wherever we go, we hold fundraisers for the community stations that run Democracy Now!, and there are 3 radio stations in Vancouver. So we're crossing the border. It's Wednesday of Thanksgiving. And we hand in our passports, and they pull us over. They flag us, and they tell us we've got to go into this big border facility. So we go in, it's pouring rain, and it's really close to the talk, so I have to get out of there so that I can go up to the library. And, you know, they call me up to the counter, and they say, Amy, we want your notes. I said, my notes for what? They said, your notes for your talk tonight. Well, now, I don't really speak from notes, so I went out to the car, and I got a copy of the book, and I came in, and I gave it to them. And there were 3 guards, you know, they were all armed. One of them was entering everything I was saying into a computer. Another was handwriting everything I was saying, and the other started reading the book, which I took as a good sign. So they said, what are you going to be talking about tonight? And I was very taken aback, but it's sort of a no man's land there. You don't know what your rights are. And I really had to get there. So I said, well, I was going to start with the last column. What I basically do is I read excerpts of columns I said, and I riff off them. So I was going to start with the last column, which is about Tommy Douglas. The title, Healthcare Reform Needs an Action Hero. Tommy Douglas, who is considered the greatest Canadian. He was the premier of Saskatchewan in the early 60s. Well, when he was a kid, he almost lost his leg, and a doctor offered to help him for free. He was poor. And so when he grew up and he became a politician, he thought, the one thing I want to bring to Canada is single-payer health care, is national health care system, is what they call Medicare. And so as premier of Saskatchewan, he introduced it. And his major opponent was the American Medical Association, right, based here. Why? Because they were afraid the contagion would spread south. And they led a 3-week strike of Canadian doctors, but Tommy Douglas won. And they adopted Medicare in Saskatchewan. Then he traversed Canada until it was adopted everywhere. Extremely popular program in Canada. I'm telling the guards this story, the Canadian guards. This is the Canadian side of the border. I said, I don't really get it. I'm being detained here. Sarah Palin just came here and trashed your system. She was able to go all over Canada. But anyway, so I said, so I wrote my column on it because, well, this is how I started it. Imagine the scene. America, 2009, 18,000 people have died in 1 year, an average of almost 50 a day. Who's taking them out? What's killing them? To investigate, President Obama might be tempted to call on Jack Bauer, the fictional rogue intelligence agent from the hit TV series 24, who invariably employs torture and a host of other illegal tactics to help the president fight terrorism. But terrorism isn't the culprit here. It's lack of adequate health care. So maybe the president's solution isn't Jack Bauer, but rather the actor who plays him. You know who the star of 24 is. Kiefer Sutherland. Well, his family has very deep connections to health care reform. His grandfather is Tommy Douglas, the man who brought single-payer health care to Canada. Yes, Kiefer Sutherland is the grandson of Tommy Douglas. His mother is Shirley Douglas. His father is Donald Sutherland. And Kiefer Sutherland, if he spoke out here, would have a tremendous impact. You know, he speaks to a very right-wing audience. 24 is like Rush Limbaugh's favorite show. Glenn Beck loves it. Rush Limbaugh visited the set of 24. He should learn from the real-life actor who plays his hero, Jack. Limbaugh and his cohorts might find truth not as satisfying as fiction. Now, Kiefer Sutherland does speak out in Canada. He was speaking at a big rally in Alberta. He said, private health care doesn't work. America's trying to change their system. It's too expensive to get comprehensive medical care in the US. Why on earth are we going to follow their system here? Kiefer Sutherland said, I consider it a humanitarian issue. This is an issue about what is right and wrong, what is decent and what is not. Maybe Jack Bauer can save the day, I said to the Canadian Border Guards. And it's getting really late. And they said, what else are you talking about? So I said, well, I thought I would talk about the global economic meltdown. What else are you talking about, they said. I said, well, I was going to talk about global warming. What else are you talking about? I said, well, maybe this would be the trigger. I was going to talk about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What else are you talking about? I said, well, I mean, like, I only have an hour that pretty much does it. And they said, are you denying you're talking about the Olympics? I said, the Olympics? I mean, anyone who knows me, I'm not really into watching organized sports, though I do like to play sports. And so I didn't even know what they were talking about. This is how limited my world is. I said, you mean when President Obama went to Copenhagen to try to get the Olympics to Chicago? And he said, yeah, and you didn't get them. I said, I know we didn't get them. I said, you mean the Rio Olympics? He said, I'm talking about the Vancouver Olympics. I said, oh, I mean, it really wasn't on my radar at all. And I said, no, well, until now, I wasn't planning to talk about the Olympics. And because I was so incredulous, he clearly didn't believe me. He told me to sit down, and they went through our car. I was with two colleagues. One of them is Chuck Skurich. He's handing out Daily Digest. If you want to sign up for our daily headlines and news alerts and folks in other places, you can just go to our website and sign up. But I was there with Chuck and Dennis Moynihan, who edited the columns, and they went through everything. They went through our computers. They were on our computers when I went out to check on them, going through all my notes. It was a very serious violation. Then when they came in, they brought me in a back room. They took 4 pictures of me and my colleagues. They stapled what they called control documents into our passport. I said I didn't think we need a visa to come into Canada. And they said, these aren't visas, they're control documents. And they said we had to leave within 48 hours. And if you think I talk fast, you should see how fast I talked for the next 48 hours to get everything in. And then we left. And when I would tell people after this, they say, Canada? But we learned so much as a result. Yes, we made it to Vancouver, thank goodness for Canadians. They'd all gone out for beer, and they all came back and brought their friends, so it was a packed audience. And it became the top story in Canada. You know, American journalists detained at the border, and CBC, and the Toronto Globe and Mail, and the Toronto Sun. I mean, everywhere I was going, I was being interviewed. But when I watched their pieces, the piece right after the one covering me, for example, was about the Vancouver City Council and how it had passed legislation that if you had a sign in your house that said anything against the Olympics, your house could be raided. Athletes weren't allowed to speak out against corporations that sponsored the Olympics. It was very serious. The issue of free speech was serious. And, you know, 2 nights ago, I was speaking at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and that afternoon, the students invited people for a free lunch if they were willing to give up free speech, which was very cool. It was the journalists' organization there. They said, anyone who wants, who is willing to give up free speech and freedom of the press, come on in and have lunch. And then they had protests outside, and, you know, they sort of played this all out. But, you know, freedom of the press, freedom of speech is extremely important. And it was violated there, especially as they went through our notes. And we've got to take these things seriously, like what happened at the Republican convention just 2 years ago. Let's see, I was here 2 years ago. It was a couple months before the conventions. And of course, Democracy Now! Was out in force, breaking with convention, war, peace, and the presidency, from the streets to the suites to the convention floor. We went to Denver, and then we flew on to Minneapolis, St. Paul to cover the Republican convention after the Democrats. It was the first day of the convention, Labor Day. for the Republican convention. There was a major protest that morning of 10,000 people led by soldiers. Amazing. Some in full military regalia who are saying no to war. You know, they take great risk in doing this. There is a real untold story. The thousands of soldiers who've said no to war, by the way, who refuse to go. They're according to the Pentagon numbers, but they don't like to talk about it. And then there are those who go to fight in Iraq, or go to fight in Afghanistan, or go again and again and again and again, and then they refuse, or they just come home to talk about it. And they were the ones who were leading this protest of 10,000, and we were out covering it, of course. And my colleagues went back to SPNN, which is St. Paul Neighborhood Network, the public access station we were broadcasting from, and I went off to the convention floor to start to cover the convention. I was interviewing delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And then I got a call on our cell phone from our senior producer, Mike Burke. He said, come quickly to 7th and Jackson. Two of our producers, Nicole and Sharif, were arrested. He said, they were hurt. You've got to get over there. That's Nicole Abdelkadous, our senior producer, and Nicole Salazar, our multimedia producer. So I raced off the convention floor. You know, I had all the credentials on that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates. And I was with our cameraman, Rick Rowley of Big Noise Films. We raced down the streets of St. Paul, got to 7th and Jackson, a big parking lot, and the riot police had surrounded the area. They had it fully contained. I raced up to them. I was out of breath. I went up quickly. I said, you can see I've just come from the convention floor. I'd like to speak to your commanding officer. You can see I'm a credentialed reporter. We have 2 reporters inside, also fully credentialed. We need to have them released immediately. I mean, it wasn't seconds before they ripped me through that line, twisted my arms back, slapped handcuffs on me, pushed me up against the wall and onto the ground, and arrested me. Charged me with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. So I was on the ground looking desperately for Nicole and Sharif. I see Sharif across the parking lot, arms behind him, his back, his arm is bleeding. I demand to be brought to him. Finally, they bring me to him, and they had really set the handcuffs, made the handcuffs very tight. I was asking them to loosen my handcuffs, so they tightened them. So we're standing together, Sharif and I. We both have our credentials on, and we're demanding to be released, whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. Then the police pulled me over to the police wagon, and inside there was Nicole. So we were both in the police wagon, and Nicole described quickly to me what had happened. Her face was bleeding, she was handcuffed, and she had her press credential on. She said that they were at St. Paul Neighborhood Network, digitizing tape, and they heard a commotion outside. And so they raced down with camera and microphone. Like, if they hadn't, they wouldn't have been doing their job. And they raced out. They saw protesters. They saw police. She started filming. Sharif had the microphone. And then the riot police came at them en masse. And they're shouting at Nicole and Sharif, on your face, on your face. Nicole is filming. She's holding her press pass up. She's shouting back, press, press. And they take her down on her face. Her camera tumbles down. The first thing they do is they pull the battery out of her camera. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. She's on her face. They have their knee or boot in her back, and they're dragging on her legs, so it's dragging her face in the dirt, which is how it got bloodied. And then Sharif, very cool guy, he's telling the police to calm down. They take him, throw him up against the wall, kick him twice in the chest, and take him down. That's how they bloodied his arm. So they bring me to the police garage where they've erected cages for the protesters. They bring Nicole and Sharif to jail. I was charged with a misdemeanor. They faced felony riot charges. Now, if it weren't for YouTube, if it weren't for all different means of media getting out, I don't know when we would have gotten out. But within a few hours, I think the video of our arrest went up on YouTube within a half an hour. And the response apparently was just enormous. The old-fashioned way, faxing, calling, emailing, people were tweeting in, but there was huge demand for our release. In a few hours, I was released, and then Sharif and Nicole. In fact, Sharif was in jail in the same cell with the AP photographer who wasn't released when Sharif was. That's the power of organizing through community media. That's the power of making a demand. When I got out, they took me to I was called back to the convention center because the media wanted to interview me about what had happened. You know, more than 40 journalists were arrested that week, and this is completely unacceptable. But so I'm brought to the convention center. I'm in the NBC skybox, and I was being interviewed. And when they turned the camera off, there's an NBC reporter who's standing next to me, and he'd been listening to what happened. He said, "I don't get it. Why wasn't I arrested?" I said, "Oh, were you out covering the protests?" He said, "No." So I said, "Well, I'm not being arrested in the skybox either." But you know, like Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. So you gotta go there. And it's not just because we're curious, it's because it's our job. You know, yes, it's our job to get what's happening on the convention floor, the orchestrated message of the delegates, and there are differences between them, and that's interesting. It's our job to get into the corporate suites, to see who's sponsoring what. I don't know how many strawberries and hors d'oeuvres I reached for and had a door slammed in my face, you know, trying to find out who's sponsoring the Republican Governors Association in St. Paul, who's sponsoring the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee in Denver, and really following the money. You know, it's just a basic tenet of good journalism. And it's our job to go into the streets. That's where the uninvited guests are, the thousands of people who have something else to say. Democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record to put things on the record. It's that important. Now, clearly in these cases, it's not that dangerous, and we're also American reporters, and that makes a huge difference, which brings me to what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and the incredible bravery of the reporters, especially Iraqi reporters in Iraq. I mean, what they face. Arab media workers in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Tonight, I'm going to be going to the University of California, Davis, and I'll be interviewing a prison guard on stage, a prison guard from Guantanamo. And then by video hookup, we'll be speaking with Omar Dagays, who was a prisoner at Guantanamo for many years. We'll be hooking up with him in London, in Britain. But it makes me think of, for example, Sami al-Hajj. Do you know who he was? He was the Al Jazeera reporter. He was picked up going over the border from Pakistan to Afghanistan. He was held for more than 6 years at Guantanamo, never charged. He was interrogated repeatedly, well over 100 times, repeatedly asked about his bosses at Al Jazeera. Could you imagine being picked up, and you have to put yourselves in their shoes, and, well, being asked about your bosses. For more than 6 years. And then he's released. Never charged. He's back at Al Jazeera. But actually, he's lucky. What about Tariq Ayoub? He also worked for Al Jazeera. He was a 34-year-old Jordanian reporter who'd just come over the border from Jordan to work for Al Jazeera in Baghdad. This was in 2003. It was a few weeks after the U.S. invaded. And the U.S. invaded March 19th, 2003. 3 weeks later, April 8th, the day before the fall of Baghdad, Tariq had just arrived, and he was setting the camera on the roof. You know, you put the cameras on the roofs to be able to film, but also it's very dangerous, so you try to come back down very quickly and just have the camera upstairs. Well, that morning was horrendous. It started with Abu Dhabi TV. They were getting shelled by the United States, and the broadcasters were on television in Baghdad begging people to come to their aid. That was Abu Dhabi. And then they started strafing Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera had given their coordinates to the U.S. military repeatedly. Maybe that was their problem. You know, they were bombed in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. But this time, Tariq had just gone upstairs to the roof. He had just set the camera, and he was immediately killed. I've spoken to his wife since. Her name is Dima Taboub. At the funeral, she said, "Hate breeds hate. The U.S. says they're fighting terror. Who's involved with terrorism now?" And then the U.S. military set their sights on the Palestine Hotel. You remember the Palestine Hotel where hundreds of unembedded reporters were. Videographers, photographers, reporters, cameramen. And there were two who were on the balcony of their rooms. One was Taras Protsyuk. He was a Ukrainian cameraman who was reporting for Reuters. And then there was Jose Coso. Jose Coso worked for Telecinco. I think the Spanish crew in Baghdad was the largest national crew from any country at the Palestine Hotel. They filmed their own deaths. As the US military opened fire on the hotel, they killed both cameramen. His brother Javier and his mother has been fighting for years now to get justice, to bring those responsible to justice. These are the dangers that reporters face on the ground, which brings me to collateral murder in Iraq. I'm sure some of you here at Google have watched the videotape from WikiLeaks. You know, Dan Ellsberg, an American hero, the man who worked for the Pentagon and the Rand Corporation 40 years ago, had top security clearance and decided, if you ever wonder, by the way, if protest matters, he would look outside his Pentagon window and see sometimes massive protests, sometimes a few stragglers holding signs against the Vietnam War. And it just started to get to him. And then he heard about and met young people who were going to jail saying they would not fight in the war. And he thought, what am I doing to bring this war to an end? And he realized right behind him in his safe, he had the 7,000-page top secret history of US involvement in the war in Vietnam that only a few people had. That had been commissioned by the Secretary of War, Robert McNamara. And he decided to open the safe and release the history. 7,000 pages he Xeroxed and secreted them out every single night until he had them all, and he gave them to the New York Times. He wasn't sure if the Times would ever publish them. It took many months. He was nervous. He went underground with his wife, and he gave one stack of these 7,000 pages to Howard Zinn, the great historian, to keep at his house. I understand Howard was here. It is such a shame that a few months ago we lost this great humanitarian historian who wrote People's History of the United States. What a remarkable gift he gave to all of us, documenting the people's movements in this country. Every week I do this column, and when Howard died, actually Democracy Now! Was broadcasting that week from Park City, Utah. We were at the Sundance Film Festival, and I got the call from his co-editor of Voices of People's History of the United States, Anthony Arnov. It was a Thursday afternoon. We were all set for our show on Friday, the closing broadcast from Park City. And he said Howard just died. He took a break. He was in California. He went swimming, and he had a heart attack. Well, I mean, Howard had an amazing life. He lived to be 87 years old. If you haven't read his book, or you know it and you mean to, but you've never actually read it, you really should. And you don't have to take it in all at once. But the idea, well, Howard said it very well, that history, not through the eyes of presidents and generals, but through the voices of ordinary people, of rebels, of dissidents, of women, of black people, of Asian Americans, of immigrants, of socialists and anarchists and troublemakers of all time. I've been to a number of memorial services for Howard Zinn now. And Marion Wright Edelman, who founded the Children's Defense Fund, she was one of his students at Spelman. Alice Walker also was. She said he was her favorite teacher and also her funniest teacher at Spelman. Marion Wright Edelman described how daring Howard was with the students, how he would model for them. They would wear, this is a historically black college of women, and in the day they would wear white gloves and hats. And he would take them on a field trip each year or each semester. Marion Wright Edelman was on them, to go to the Georgia State Legislature and to sit in the gallery to watch the legislators. And they would sit in the all-white section, all these African-American women with their white gloves and their hats. And the Georgia legislature would come to a halt. This defiance, this impudence, unacceptable. And they would then all stand up and tip their hats, smiling broadly, and walk out. She said he taught her courage. Well, Howard Zinn was thrown out as Spelman because, as Alice put it, He loved us too much. He was thrown out because he loved us, Alice Walker, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author now. And he was pretty excited because he was going down to Spelman. It was 42 years after he hadn't had his contract renewed. In other words, he was fired. 42 years later, they invited him to come back and give the commencement address, and they were giving him an honorary degree. So if you ever think times don't change, they do. Well, I mention Howard because Daniel Ellsberg gave him a copy of the Pentagon Papers. But the New York Times did publish the Pentagon Papers. And when Daniel Ellsberg speaks today, he doesn't just rest on his laurels, helping to have ended the Vietnam War by releasing these documents. In fact, I introduced him in Portland, Oregon, at a big event of 5,000 Unitarian Universalists. And I said, I want you to tell the story of how you actually did this. It's an amazing story, by the way. And he said, I want to talk about it. I want to talk about now. This is 40 years ago. He said, you need to make sure that the Pentagon Papers are released today. Not those, but the ones now. The ones that will end the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, he is always looking forward. And it's very important and very significant. And I think that's what WikiLeaks is doing by providing a forum for people to anonymously release documents. And he was encouraged by the release of the leak of the Eikenberry memos. You know who Eikenberry is. Carl Eikenberry is the general who is now the US ambassador to Afghanistan. He wrote memos to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton that got leaked. The Eikenberry memos recommend policies opposite those of Generals David Petraeus and Stanley McChrystal, who advocated for the surge in a counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan. Eikenberry wrote that President Hamid Karzai is not an adequate strategic partner, that sending additional forces will delay the day when Afghans will take over and make it difficult, if not impossible, to bring our people home on a reasonable timetable. But Petraeus and McChrystal prevailed. The military is just about to launch a major offensive in Kandahar. Meanwhile, with shocking candor, General McChrystal said in a video conference a few weeks ago regarding the number of civilians killed by the US military. This is General McChrystal, not like a peace activist. He said, we have shot an amazing number of people, but to my knowledge, none has ever proven to be a threat. US troop fatalities, meanwhile, are occurring now at twice the rate of a year ago. So he was encouraged by the person who released the Eikenberry memos. But this WikiLeaks video is quite astounding. And you can go to democracynow.org and see our series of programs on this. And you can go, of course, to wikileaks.org and collateralmurders.org. The US military video that was released just a few weeks ago shows the indiscriminate targeting and killing of civilians in Baghdad. WikiLeaks, this media watchdog website, obtained the video and made it available on the internet. The video was made July 12, 2007 by a US military Apache helicopter gunship and includes audio of military radio transmissions. 2 Reuters employees, a photographer and his driver, were killed in the attack, along with at least 8 other people, and 2 children were seriously injured. The radio transmissions show not only the utter callousness of the soldiers laughing and swearing as they kill, but also the strict procedure they follow, ensuring that all of their attacks are clearly authorized by their chain of command. They don't just open fire, they always ask for permission. The leaked video is a grim depiction of how routine the killing of civilians has become, and is a stark reminder of how necessary journalism is and how dangerous its practice has become. The photographer, Namir Noor Eldin, was 22 years old. His driver was Saeed Shma. He was 40. Reuters demanded a full investigation. Noor Eldin, despite his youth, had been described by colleagues as one of the preeminent war photographers in Iraq. Shma was a father of 4. The video shows a group of men in an open square in Baghdad leading the 2 Reuters employees to a building nearby. Noor el-Din and Shema are shown carrying cameras. A U.S. soldier in the helicopter says, "Okay, we got a target 15 coming at you. It's a guy with a weapon." There's much back and forth between 2 helicopters and ground troops and armored vehicles nearby. Have 5 to 6 individuals with AK-47s request permission to engage. Roger that. We have no personnel east of our position, so you're free to engage. Over. The helicopter circles around with the crosshairs squarely in the center of the 8 men. WikiLeaks and its partner for this story, the Icelandic National Broadcasting Service, added subtitles to the video as well as arrows indicating who the Reuters workers were. Sustained automatic weapon fire erupts. Most of the men are killed instantly. Noor el-Din runs away, and the crosshairs follow him, shooting nonstop until he falls dead. The radio transmission continues. "All right, ha ha ha, I hit him, and then, yeah, we got one guy crawling around down there." That's Saeed Shema, the father of 4. He is seriously wounded. He's dragging himself away from the other bodies. A voice in the helicopter, seeking a rationale to shoot, says, "Come on, buddy, all you got to do is pick up a weapon. If we see a weapon, we're going to engage." A van pulls up. It's a dad with his 2 children inside because they see a wounded person and they want to pick them up. The men who come out of the van are clearly unarmed. They lift Shema up, ostensibly to carry him to medical care. The soldiers on the Apache sought and received permission to engage the van. They opened fire, tearing apart the front of the van, killing the men. The weapon used was a 30-millimeter machine gun used to pierce armor. With everyone in sight apparently dead, U.S. armored vehicles move in. When a vehicle drives over Noor el-Din's corpse, an observer in the helicopter says, laughing, "I think we just drove over a body." The troops discover 2 children in the van who'd miraculously survived. One voice on the military radio requests permission to evacuate them to a U.S. military hospital. Another voice commands them to hand the wounded children to Iraqi police for delivery to a local clinic, ensuring delayed and less adequate treatment. The U.S. military inquiry into the killings cleared the soldiers of any wrongdoing, and Reuters' Freedom of Information requests for the video were denied. Despite the Pentagon's whitewash, the attack was brutal and might have involved a war crime, since those removing the wounded are protected by the Geneva Conventions. WikiLeaks says it obtained the video from a number of military whistleblowers. WikiLeaks.org, founded in late 2006 as a secure site for whistleblowers to safely release documents, has come under attack from the U.S. and other governments. And I go on from there in that column, but this is so important, such an important development. We've got to show the pictures. We've got to show the images. You know, I begin breaking the sound barrier with a column from 3 years ago, right around the time Colin Powell was giving that push for war at the UN. And it's about the image behind the microphone in front of the UN Security Council. See, for a quarter of a century, a tapestry of Pablo Picasso's Guernica has hung at the UN. 1 minute. During the Franco years, the Spanish city of Guernica was bombed. And Pablo Picasso was so horrified in Paris, he just painted in a 3-week frenzy. And the resulting painting, Guernica, has become the most famous anti-war symbol around the world because it shows the pain and the agony of war etched in the faces of the people and the animals. And he said he would never let his painting be shown in Spain under the fascist general Franco. And so it traveled the world, and he was afraid it would get destroyed. So he had 3 tapestries made by Parisian weavers, perfect tapestry reproductions of Guernica. And one of those hangs at the UN. It has for a quarter of a century, right behind the microphone in front of the UN Security Council. And when the war was about to begin, and Colin Powell and other US and UN officials were making pro-war announcements, it wasn't lost on them the irony of having this famous anti-war symbol be their backdrop. And so they shrouded Guernica. They covered it with a blue curtain. It is our job to open up those curtains, to show the images. I really do think that if for 1 week we saw the images of war above the fold in every newspaper surviving in this country, the top of every newscast on television, the top of every website, we saw the images of babies dead on the ground, of women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs from Iraq to Afghanistan to Pakistan. If we saw the soldiers dead and dying for just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. My one request would be that if you do have a question, please come to the mic so we can make sure that it's recorded. Thanks.
Hi. So it seems that a while back, Noam Chomsky wrote a fantastic book, Manufacturing Consent, which meticulously laid out how mainstream media does just that, manufactures the consent of the people. Since then, it doesn't seem that there's been any progress. In fact, possibly an opposite trend as media continues to manufacture consent throughout major broadcasts throughout the world almost. I'm just wondering if that's reversible, if that needs a grassroots organization to supersede that, like WikiLeaks, like the internet, like YouTube, like other democracy-based systems, or if there is any genuine hope in a top-down change from these, major broadcasts.
Oh, I think there is, because these networks that act as a conveyor belt for the lies of the government won't survive. I mean, when President Bush, started intoning WMD, if he had just a megaphone on the steps of the White House, he might have convinced a few people. But he had something more powerful. He had the media institutions of this country. And when it turned out to be not the case that there were weapons of mass destruction, that exposed more than Bush. It exposed the media of this country. And I think that's why people turned away. They didn't believe the newspapers, right? They saw the media was manufacturing consent for war. I think it's part of why Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, has grown so much. Our audience is bigger than CNN, is bigger than MSNBC. On over 800 stations and online at democracynow.org, video and audio podcasting, headlines in Spanish. It's because people were looking for other sources, other ways of getting information. So I really do think that they don't have a choice anymore. Right before the invasion, Phil Donahue was the top host on MSNBC. You might remember, Phil, who had the Donahue Show. But then he came back, that was on NBC. Then he came back on MSNBC and he had a talk show every night at 8, and it was the highest rated show. We write about this, and I think exception to the rulers. This memo surfaced after he was fired on the eve of the invasion, even though he was the most popular. And this memo surfaced where NBC said, as we move into war, we're not going to have this anti-war face on our network as the other networks are waving the American flag. And it is very serious, the level of censorship and self-censorship in this country. It doesn't usually come down as a corporation comes into the newsroom and says, you will not do this story. It's not as obvious as that. The most serious is the self-censorship. You're a young reporter, you come to a newspaper or to a network, and you know what stories get you marginalized, and you know what stories or things that you say that will, have you rise in the ladder. And that's what has to be challenged, is breaking this consensus that isn't the consensus of the American people, but the consensus of this minority elite in the networks. I do have hope. As we break stories at Democracy Now! That are picked up by other networks, I call it trickle-up journalism. And I think that really is the hope.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you
for continuing doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Hey, Amy. I'm a huge fan of the show. I love the show. It's such a service to democracy. I still don't really have a question in my head, but I would just be really upset if I were here in front of you and I didn't ask a question. So,
Oh, I know. I hear your question. How can you help get word out? Was that your question?
Sure.
Well, I think we have flyers in the back and people can download them. And really, the way we get word out, and thank you for asking such an insightful question, is by telling people, spreading the stories, signing up for the Daily Digest, spreading them around, passing them out to your friends. It's really how that the show has grown. And in this area, if you don't have Democracy Now! On TV or radio, get it on your station. We're putting the public back in public media.
Yeah, I do tell everybody. I tell my Republican father about you and your show. I try to get him to listen. And when I've followed, any like the Pat Tillman story that you had on, which was absolutely brilliant. I subsequently saw the Pat Tillman documentary at Sundance.
Amazing.
And I read the John Krakauer book. And what really struck me is after I educated myself, basically I had learned everything from your 20-minute, 40-minute segment on your show about that, and it was just factually just perfectly accurate and completely squared with those other two accounts. So,
I mean, your Republican father, we have many Republican fathers who watch Democracy Now! It is not only a bridge between communities, but between generations, because it's not about a political ideology. It's about having people speak for themselves. And there is an authenticity in that that affects everyone. It's news with a heart, news with passion. And I hope you tell people about it.
I will. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about you suggesting that news media should publish the real pictures of what is happening. So when I first came to this country, I come from India. When there are elections, it's like a big festival. It's like people are going in cars and megaphones screaming at people.
In India.
In India, yeah. And there are fights, all kinds of things happen. So people know there is an election. Whereas when I see an election here, it's so sanitized on television in a beautiful conference hall, people wearing lapels and all that. There is no excitement. There is no life in the election. It's like packaged stuff being delivered to people. So the first thought that came to me was this country can be easily taken over. It's like on cable television, you put anything, people would just consume and change their mind. So I really like your idea of putting out real pictures of war to influence people. But I also fear that people would get desensitized after seeing so much of this happening. So
I don't think people get desensitized. I think you get desensitized when you don't see it, when you know somehow it's out there, but if you're not seeing the images, well, then it must not be that bad. I contrast what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. President Bush immediately invoked an executive order that said you can't photograph, videotape, film the flag-draped coffins of the soldiers coming home. And this went on for a long time. And then you contrast that with what happened with Katrina, with the hurricane in New Orleans. Right afterwards, Bush doesn't send in the National Guard, right? But they do try to invoke this executive order that you can't show the bodies that are floating in the water. And the editor of the Times-Picayune said, "You've got to be kidding. That's the story." And you think about the reaction to what happened in New Orleans, because here you have Bush not responding. And so you have all these reporters from the corporate networks going down, and they're not being spun, right? There's no one there to embed with. And so you see these images, like I remember seeing this young woman reporter from CNN, and she's reporting, and a man comes up, and he's holding his boy, and he's clearly in shock, and he said, he had just come out of the water. He said he was holding his wife's hand, and as her hand slipped out of his, she said, "Take care of the children." And he told the story, and he turned around with his boy, and he walked off into the water, and the reporter started to cry. And then you see the bodies floating by. And that's what reporting from ground zero looks like. Unembedded, unfiltered reporting. And I think it shocked this nation. That's the power of the image.
maybe for the first time. I've seen such images for a long time. After some time, you just switch off. People get used to it. That's my fear. So, thank you.
Well, thanks for your comment.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, first of all. My name is Ola Rosling. I would like to ask a more sensitive question. Being Google and YouTube, etc., we obviously can play the role of the good guy often. What is your general advice for Google to remain part of the good world and not doing evil as Google is growing bigger and bigger and bigger? In general, I would like to hear your opinions about that. In specific, I would like to hear your comments about a previous speaker in this series of authors, Kissinger, who was invited to give a presentation here. Thank you.
Kissinger called Daniel Ellsberg the most dangerous man in America. And that's now the name of the Oscar-nominated film about Dan Ellsberg, and I encourage everyone to watch it. I had an interesting encounter with Henry Kissinger years ago. 2 nights ago when I was in Wisconsin, when we did the Q&A after a young man, graduate student, spoke, and he was from East Timor. Kissinger had a great deal to do with the genocide in East Timor. He was Secretary of State in 1975 under President Ford. And Kissinger and Ford, well, this is after, let's see, Kissinger and Nixon with the war in Vietnam, of course. I don't know how many millions of Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians died, 55,000 US troops. Then Argentina, deeply involved with supporting the junta there in Argentina. Tens of thousands of dissidents died in Argentina, with Kissinger in particular supporting the murderous generals. In Timor, he went and met with the long-reigning dictator Suharto in 1975, a day before Indonesia invaded Timor. He went with Ford. They met with Suharto. They gave the go-ahead for the invasion. 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. Ford and Kissinger flew off. They were meeting the next day with another leader, Ferdinand Marcos. And as they flew out, the Indonesian soldiers landed by air and by sea in Timor. And they closed the country to the outside world, and they commenced the slaughter that lasted for a quarter of a century and killed off a third of the population. It's just to give you a little background. When I got a chance to meet Henry Kissinger, he was flacking his book Diplomacy at an event in New York. And we had gone to see him speak. And the first person to ask a question was a young Timorese man. His name was Constancio Pinto. He's now the Timorese ambassador to the United States. And Constancio talked about the missing chapter in diplomacy. He asked him about Henry Kissinger's role in Timor, and he said, "Why did you do this to my people?" And Kissinger's face got bright red. There was a Portuguese film crew there that was filming, and they said they just saw his face transform. And he clearly needed to buy some time to figure out what to say to this very peaceful, earnest question of one of the survivors of Timor. And he said, "First of all, I want to thank you for not ripping up this place." The next person to speak was Alan Nairn, who is an investigative journalist of impeccable credentials, incredibly brave reporter. And he got up and he asked him about the cables that he sent back to the United States as people high up in the State Department were writing cables to Kissinger and to Ford, but to Kissinger because they were in the State Department, he was Secretary of State, saying, "We are not going to be able to justify the Indonesian invasion of Timor. We won't be able to continue to sell the weapons to Indonesia because they're using them for offensive purposes. What are we going to do?" When he got back to the United States, he held a high-level meeting of State Department officials, and he castigated them for leaving a paper trail. And he said, "We will not kick our ally in the teeth." He knew exactly what was happening. And I tell that now because this is not just a story from more than 25 years ago. You may know about Timor and the Santa Cruz massacre in 1991. It was 17 years into the occupation. I got a chance to go to Timor with Alan Nairn, And it was November 12th, 1991. The Indonesian military occupied the whole island. The people were holding a procession for a young man who'd been killed 2 weeks before. There were thousands of Timorese. They were at the cemetery. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. We were interviewing people. This was a land where there was no freedom of press, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly. And yet they marched to the cemetery, putting up their hands in the V sign saying, "Viva East Timor, viva independence." And soldiers marched up on them, 10 to 12 abreast, holding their USM-16s at the ready position. Alan and I thought maybe if we walked to the front of the crowd, they would not commit a massacre, because though we knew they'd committed many, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. And we always hid our equipment, but this time we put it on, headphones. I held up my microphone like a flag. I slung my radio, my tape recorder over my shoulder. Alan put the camera above his head. We walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up. They swept around the corner. They swept past us, and without warning, without hesitation, without provocation, they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down, a little boy behind us, putting his hands up in the V sign, exploded from the gunfire. The soldiers went after us, a group of them. They brought me down, beating me. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire on the crowd. And then he threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury. And they took their USM-16s like baseball bats and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we were laying on the ground. He was covered in blood. They were killing everyone around us. And a group of soldiers put the guns to our heads, our guns, USM-16s. And they were shouting politique in Australia. Politique, they were saying it was political to witness this, for us to witness this. But that's our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And they were shouting Australia because they were demanding to know if we were from Australia. That's because 17 years before, when Indonesia invaded, there were 5 Australian-based journalists covering the invasion. They lined them up against a house, the Indonesian soldiers, and they executed them all. The 6th, Roger East, was reporting from a radio station in Dili, the capital of Timor, the day after the invasion. They dragged him out of the radio station, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor with thousands of Timorese and killed him. So the Australian government hardly protested their killings, we believe, because years later, Australia and Indonesia would sign the Timor Gap Treaty, dividing up Timor's oil between Australia and Indonesia. Oil is the source of so much pain in the world. So as we lay on the ground, Alan covered in blood, the soldiers with their guns at our heads at the ready position, we shouted back, "America." They had stripped us now of everything. The only thing I had left was my passport, and I threw it at them. As we shouted America, I'd get kicked in the stomach. When they'd get my breath back, I'd say America. And at some point, they pulled the guns from our heads. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us that they had never had to pay for killing the Timorese. They killed more than 270 Timorese on that one day. And that was not one of the larger massacres. So when Alan stood up to ask Kissinger about why he had authorized this invasion, Kissinger was enraged. And he said, "It's people like you that prevent diplomacy from taking place." Well, Kissinger's kind of diplomacy. And then I asked him about sitting on the board of Freeport-McMoRan and how Freeport-McMoRan, the gold and copper mining company in Indonesia, was lobbying against any kind of cutting of aid to Indonesia because of its human rights abuses. So that's then. Now let's come to today. Alan's in Indonesia. He's in a great deal of danger right now. Because you know when Obama was supposed to go to Indonesia a few weeks ago, but because of the healthcare debate, he put off the trip until June. It's going to be a big homecoming. You know, it's going to get a lot of attention. It's going to be a big personal story for Obama because he grew up partly in Indonesia. He went to elementary school there because his mom married an Indonesian student at the University of Hawaii. Suharto called all the foreign students back, and so the family moved to Indonesia. There's all these statues to Obama and everything, and they're very proud of President Obama. So that's the story that's going to be told. But what's going on behind the scenes is President Obama is attempting to restore full military aid to the Indonesian military and to the Kopassus, the feared military unit in Indonesia, saying that that story, well, he doesn't disagree with it, is the old Indonesian military. Now, this is about the new Indonesian military. But what Alan has exposed in the last few months is that this same Indonesian military has been engaged in a series of assassinations of political activists in Aceh, and that it is going on in this past year. There's a fierce battle going on between the White House and Congress as Obama tries to restore the aid. It's a huge story in Indonesia. Alan's exposing this. And as a result of him exposing it on Democracy Now! And at his blog at alannairn.com, ALLANNAIRN, the Indonesian military says they're going to arrest him. It's the zipper under the news. When he went on a big TV station, they cut him off after 2 minutes, and the producer came on, actually very apologetic, and said, "I'm so sorry. I know we said we'd have you on for half an hour, but a new policy has come down." And Alan said, "What is the policy?" "Shit, I don't know, but it means that you can't be on our station." And then when the other major TV news channel a few weeks ago tried to have him on, the head of Kopassus said he will not be allowed on unless we're on. And so they said, "Okay, would you come on as well?" And they said no. But Alan says, "Arrest me," he says. He wants to be arrested, he says, if he can try this in an open court and call, subpoena the generals and the US officials involved in these assassinations. He said, if what I'm saying is what you say, slandering the Indonesian military, well, then you can put me in jail. But let's try this in open court. And that's the situation he's in today, and I hope everyone continues to follow it. I would have liked to raise that with Henry Kissinger. I think it is a real injustice when you see Henry Kissinger on television and he is treated simply as an elder statesman without describing the policies that he presided over for so many years. I think you could start by simply, when he's speaking, you know the lower third on television, that's the ID that talks about, you know, the name and what they did. If it would just flash the number of people who died under his reign here, and also flash how much money he makes consulting with various countries. They often, it's not only Kissinger, so often when you're watching television, when it comes to the generals or, quote, elder statesmen, tell us who it is they're working for now. It's not just advice they're giving from the past, from their past expertise. They are making money, particularly David Barstow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter, exposed this. When you have retired generals on, they're working for military contractors, and you should know who they're working for when they offer their advice. As for Google, well, I hope you have major discussions here around, and I'm not that knowledgeable about, as knowledgeable as you all are, but for example, the issue of the libraries. This is of grave concern. Obviously, I'm a book lover, and I am deeply concerned about the privatization of knowledge in the world. I think that Brewster Kahle, who does archive.org, you know, a public, archive.org is where Democracy Now! You could see all of our past shows right to the beginning. But the idea of keeping the knowledge, the information open and accessible to the public, the legacy of everyone. Of course, the fear is, as Google works out these secret deals with libraries around the country, and I guess probably around the world, that what happens next? You know, what gets privatized? What books won't we have access to? What information will you all be making money off of that we won't be able to access? And these are the serious concerns. It starts off just by saying, let's digitize it all, you know, let's preserve it. But is that ultimately what will happen? And right now, the question, you know, the question, the issues raised are, we have no intention to make it not accessible. But, you know, times change, and maybe there are intentions not to make it accessible to all. But we have to preserve the public commons. You know, that is what will save us. And that's what I'm deeply concerned about when this information goes private. Yes.
Hi, Amy. Thanks very much for coming. I think a lot of us were very hopeful when the Obama administration came on board, and have since lost some hope with respect to decisions such as corporate bailouts and Alaska oil drilling and escalation of the war in Afghanistan. What would you say to us who have lost hope or are somewhat disillusioned by this administration? And then secondly, would you ever consider running for office yourself? Please.
On the issue like of oil drilling, of course, grave concern as we look at what's happening off the coast of Louisiana. Could be the biggest oil spill in the history of this country right now. That's unfolding as we speak. We broadcast from Stanford today, and I'd encourage you to go to our website, democracynow.org, because we had a very interesting interview talking about what this could mean. But as for hope, you know, what happened on Election Day in 2008 was historic. There's no question about that. You know, the election of an African-American president in a land with a history, a legacy of slavery, just unbelievable. And what it meant for people all over the world. Last week, we broadcast from Cochabamba, from Bolivia. I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but at an amazing summit of 15,000 people, mainly indigenous, as an answer to what happened in Copenhagen, you know, the climate talks. And this was a people summit because it's people in the South that are most gravely affected. Here you have this Andean nation of 10 million. Their glaciers are melting. The cities, the largest urban areas, will run out of water through no fault of their own because of what we're doing in the North and the, you know, most industrialized countries in the world. And I interviewed President Morales for the last broadcast last Friday, the Bolivian president. He had something interesting to say. I asked him what he thought of President Obama. Because after the Copenhagen Accord, which Ecuador and Bolivia did not sign on to because they felt it wasn't binding and would not do enough, the U.S. cut millions of dollars in aid to both countries. I think it was $2.5 million to Ecuador. They cut $3 million to Bolivia. And much of it was for climate change projects, to punish them for not supporting the accord. And he was saying, this is what democracy looks like. Sure, you can say no, but then we're going to hurt you. And interestingly, on Earth Day, the Ecuadorian foreign minister spoke at the big rally in Cochabamba, and he said, I will give the U.S. $2.5 million if they will sign on to the Kyoto Accord. But Morales said, what can I say? That your first African-American president would discriminate against the first indigenous president of Bolivia, because Morales is the first indigenous president. But an answer to the question of hope. A few weeks after President Obama was elected, I was invited on CNN to, you know, respond to, it was the day that President and Mrs. Obama went to the White House to meet with the Bushes. You know, he was elected, but they weren't yet moving in. And so it was in the afternoon, I was sitting in the CNN studios, and they were chattering about something, and then the Obamas were walking into the White House, and they asked me about something else. I said, no, wait. We have to take pause. I mean, look at what's happening right now. Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama are walking into the White House in which they will live. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, her grandfather comes from South Carolina. They are the descendants of slaves, which means their children, Malia and Sasha, are the descendants of slaves, and they will live in the White House, the most famous house in the world that was built by slaves. Let's take pause. Now, what about all of the policies in the last year, particularly the surge in Afghanistan? President Obama making Bush's war Obama's war, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize as he announces the surge, talking about Dr. King, I think 6 times in that Nobel acceptance speech, Dr. King, who on April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was assassinated, gave that famous address at Riverside Church. Even those in his inner circle said, don't do it, don't take on the war in Vietnam. You've gotten so much for civil rights and voting rights. This is not your issue. And he said, he talked about the country he loved, and he said, my country is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, Dr. King did. And, you know, I think for a long time, people have felt in this country that they have hit their head against a brick wall. And that brick wall has now become a door. And the door is open a crack. And the question is, will you kick it open or will it be slammed shut? And I don't think it's up to President Obama. I think that's up to all of you. I mean, he was elected by millions of new voters, especially young voters, anti-war voters, amazing coalition of people inspired by him. But, I mean, the good thing is this community organizer, the community organizer in chief now has become, well, the community organizer first, let me address that one. That's an amazing thing. So now parents all over the country are saying to their kids, maybe you can be a community organizer too. That's pretty amazing. But the community organizer in chief has become the commander in chief. And who's going to do the community organizing now? And that's up to all of you. Maybe the answer isn't something Obama once said. I heard the story, I wasn't there, but a year and a half before the election, he was campaigning in New Jersey, and he was at one of these fundraisers in the backyard of a house in Montclair, New Jersey. And people were asking him questions, he was about to go, and this guy raised his hand and said, what about the Middle East? And Obama related the story of A. Philip Randolph, the greatest community organizer of the 20th century. You know, he organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the black porters on the Pullman trains. He organized the 1963 March on Washington. And Eleanor Roosevelt took A. Philip Randolph to meet FDR. And A. Philip Randolph said to FDR, talked about the condition of black people in this country, of working people in this country. And FDR, this is the story Obama told, FDR turned to A. Philip Randolph and said, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but you've got to make me do it. Make me do it. And that's what Obama said on the issue of the Middle East. Make me do it. And I really think that's what democracy is all about. If you feel strongly about something, about the critical issues of the day, you got to make him do it.
All right. I just wanted to say thanks so much for what you do. It's deeply needed, and thanks for coming today.
Thank you very much.